Hey everybody, this is Dream, and so we really only have two or three teams this week that are still vying for playoffs situations. Milwaukee and Philadelphia are both them, and then the Mets are still trying to get to the Braves to win their division. Obviously, those three teams are playing today. The Atlanta Braves are playing earlier slate. So with that said, let's get into this slate. My teams for stacking situations are the Dodgers, the Mets, and the Brewers. There's a couple other teams like Seattle that you could take a look at, and even Toronto as well. I think all of those teams are in good spots here for really solid games. But keep in mind that some of these pitchers and stuff are probably not going to pitch too deep for one because of coming back from injuries or the fact that their divisions are locked up or playoffs are locked up and they're trying to get ready for that. So with that said, let's get into the pitchers I do like, and I'll try to give you the best information on these 5 pitchers that I've looked at for DraftKings today that are going to be useful. The first is going to be Brendan Woodruff. Now, he's been pretty solid lately, averaging 25 fantasy points a game last 10. And he should want to actually complete this game and do really well. He should want to go deep because of the reality of the Brewers on the outside looking in at the playoffs. I'll show you the playoff standings here real quick. We've got Milwaukee here, a couple games off of Philadelphia to make the playoffs, so it's up to them to win these games, and so he's going to be somebody that's going to help them do that. So with that said, he's going to have to play in order to get this win. Now, in one game against Arizona this season, he didn't do very good. He only got 4 fantasy points and had 4 strikeouts, so that is uneasy. But this game is at Milwaukee instead of Arizona this time. And I looked for him, who's been pitching pretty well lately, to have a better game. He's also a lot better at home than on the road. You can see he's averaging 27 fantasy points at home and 16 on the road. So I look for him to have a good game here. Then we're going to look at Lance McCullers. Now, he might be on a pitch count, so just be aware of that. But he's been really solid the last 10 games, averaging 20 fantasy points a game. He's been day-to-day due to being sick, but he should be back and be able to play a good, solid game here. You just have to be aware that he might not pitch as many pitches, so he may only last 5 or 6 innings. But he still has strikeout potential, which helps here. And he's also been pretty good in his last 4 games. He's only pitched 7 games this season. So then we're going to look at Tony Gonsolin. He's been really consistent most of the season, and he's been pretty solid lately. He's averaging 19 fantasy points a game the last 10. He's also had 2 games against Colorado where he's been kind of inconsistent, averaging 12 fantasy points a game versus them. But he does tend to score around 15 to 20 fantasy points. But he also may be on a pitch limit, so you do need to take that into consideration before this game comes up. Then we're going to look at George Kirby for Seattle. He's averaging 18.3 fantasy points a game, and he's been really good against Detroit. Now, he hasn't been as good. He's been pretty inconsistent when it comes to like big games and small games, but he either has a 20 to 25 point game where he'll have like a 5-point game. It's not much in between. So you do have to be a little concerned about that. But he's been good against Detroit, and he's much better against left-handed hitters than right-handed hitters. He's not been great against right-handed hitters, but he doesn't give up a ton of runs. So as long as he doesn't give up a ton of runs and he gets some strikeouts, he should be okay here. Then we're going to look at Patrick Sandoval. He's averaging almost 20 fantasy points a game. And he's actually had 3 games against Oakland, averaging 19. But he has been solid. He's been inconsistent otherwise, but he's surprisingly been pretty solid as of late. And he doesn't really have the upside of some of the other guys because he doesn't get the strikeouts, but he's still in a pretty good spot here. Now, I'm going to talk about Aaron Nola. I don't love him here. This is a really tough matchup for him against Houston, and he hadn't pitched against them either. But he does have the potential to get a decent chunk of strikeouts, and he also needs to pitch good in this game if Philadelphia is going to deal with the keeping their spot here in the wild card. So I don't really like him. I'm not going to utilize him unless everybody else is on pitch counts where you only have there's only 2 pitchers or even pitching deep. But I don't have much like for him simply because of the matchup. So let's go ahead and get into the catchers here. And catcher really just looks really easy for me today. It's going to be obvious to go with Danny Jansen. He's averaging almost 300 and hitting 8 fantasy points a game for the last 10. He's been really consistent lately, getting good scores, and it's not been too difficult, and his price is pretty reasonable. Then we're going to look at Alejandro Kirk. Now, he hasn't been hitting the ball as well, but he's in a good situation for this matchup, and he did take a game off. So let's look for him to get a good game back here. Adley Rutschman is a guy that I really like lately. He's averaging almost 10 fantasy points a game, including 2 home runs in those games. And he's been really consistent at getting on base and stuff like that. Then we're going to look at Will Smith, who's been extremely good for the Dodgers, averaging 8.8 fantasy points a game. His price is a little bit high, but, he's averaged 8 fantasy points against Colorado this season as well. But keep note that this game is in the Dodger Stadium. And then you could also look at Austin Barnes for Colorado as well, for the Dodgers as well if he plays. Though he hasn't been hitting the ball quite as well, he's still a home run threat in this matchup. Then we're going to look at first base. First of all, we got Freddie Freeman. He's the top option. He's a home run threat on this game. He's been a little bit boom or bust lately, but he's been pretty consistent otherwise. And he's hitting 281, averaging 8 fantasy points a game, and I really love him in this matchup. I think he's my top home run threat on the slate. Then Nathaniel Lowe, he's averaging 7 fantasy points a game. He's also hit 2 home runs in that time. In the last couple games, he's hit 2 as well, and I really like how he's playing. I think he's a top option here against the Yankees. Vladimir Guerrero Jr., his batting average has dropped off, but his ability to hit home runs hasn't. And so if he can get a home run here against Baltimore's pitching, which he should be able to do, Kramer's not very good, he'll have an opportunity to have a big game here. And then we're going to look at Brandon Drury for San Diego. He's averaging almost 8 fantasy points a game, and he's been really good against San Francisco this season. And this game's in San Diego, so that's a little bit easier than being in San Francisco. So I really like San Diego against San Francisco's pitching today. And then Pete Alonso for the Mets. He's got to have a good game if they're going to hang on here. He's been great against Washington this season, having 6 home runs in 16 games. And I look for him as a home run threat in this matchup. And then finally, Anthony Rizzo for the Yankees against Texas. Now, Texas pitcher is pretty good, but he is a guy that has to have a big game if the Yankees are going to continue to play as the way that they're doing. We're going to go and get to second base here. Whit Merrifield, he's a nice cheap option that I really like, and I also project for him to hit a home run. He's averaging a whopping 429 with 11.7 fantasy points a game for the last 10. He's had 4 home runs in those games. And I think he's just really fun in a stride right now for Toronto. So, he's probably somebody that I'm most locking into my lineup as it is. But we have some other options here. Whit Merrifield can actually play outfield too. So, Gleyber Torres is extremely good lately, averaging 13 fantasy points a game, hitting 379. Like I said about Texas's pitcher, he's pretty good, but this is a good situation for Torres. And so I like him in this matchup. Colton Wong's another guy I really like here. He's averaging almost 9 fantasy points a game as well. And Milwaukee does need him to have a big game here, even though he's a little bit boom or bust. Didn't have much at second base, but at third base, we have a lot. Donaldson for the Yankees. He's averaging almost 7 fantasy points a game, hitting 282 in the last 10. He is kind of due for a home run, and this is the type of situation where I think he could get it. Then Max Muncy. He's going up against Urena, and he hasn't been hitting the ball well. His batting average stinks, but he is a boom or bust candidate, and he is, he has some potential here. Obviously, his price is not ideal. Matt Chapman is a guy that I do like here against Baltimore. I really like Toronto today, even though he's hitting absolutely terrible right now. He kind of feels like what Matt Olson felt like for a couple weeks recently. But as you can tell, with Matt Olson, he's gotten himself going again and hit a home run in, I think, 4 straight games now. So it's just a matter of time before Chapman breaks out of that slump and does that himself. And then Gunnar Henderson for Baltimore against Toronto. Obviously not the most ideal matchup for him against Barrios, but he's been hitting decently well, and it's just a matter of time before he hits another home run. And he's been good against Toronto this season. Manny Machado is a guy I really like at third base as well. He's averaging 11 fantasy points a game. He's killed San Francisco this year, averaging 13 fantasy points a game, and I look for him to have another extremely solid game in this matchup. Looking at shortstop, Perez, how do I say Oswald Perez for the Yankees. He's averaging about 5.5 fantasy points a game, but he's in a nice little plus matchup here. He's not a home run threat, but he's been hitting the ball pretty decently, and he's kind of a value option if you need it at this position. Then we have Bo Bichette for Toronto, another guy I really like in this matchup against Baltimore. He's had 6 home runs in 16 games against Baltimore this season. I look for him to continue that onslaught. Wander Franco for Tampa Bay is in a really good slot here against Boston. He's averaging 9 fantasy points a game the last 10. Not a big home run threat, but he's been hitting the ball really well. Trey Turner for the Dodgers has not been hitting well lately, averaging only 6 fantasy points a game. But it's just a matter of time before he has another gigantic game and then kind of gets going again. And obviously the Dodgers need him to get going, especially as we get towards the playoffs. In the outfielder situation, we have Jared Kelenic. He's averaging 8.7 fantasy points a game, and he's in a nice plus matchup here against Detroit. He just started going crazy the last week or two. He's extremely boomer bust though, so you have to be aware of that. But he is a really good value option if you need it. And then we got Oswaldo Cabrera for the Yankees. He's averaging 9 fantasy points a game, and he's gotten home runs and stuff like that in those games. He's due to have some more good games as we close out the season, and he's the guy that you know is going to play, which is always a bonus late in the season here. Ramil Tiapa is also hitting the ball really well, 7 fantasy points a game. He hit a home run recently, and I look for him to have a couple more solid games as we round up the end of the season. One thing that's really good about some of these value guys is that you kind of know that they're going to play in these games since most of these teams are locked in or out of the playoffs. And so it's just a matter of picking them that, get the hits today. Trace Thompson is averaging about 7 fantasy points a game. He's another guy that kind of fits in that scenario where he'll definitely get at-bats, and he's a pretty good option and has hit the ball well lately. Whit Merrifield, is I already mentioned him at in this situation. Andrew McCutchen for Milwaukee, he's averaging 6 fantasy points a game last 10, but they do need him to have a big game here. He's definitely going to play the whole game, so he's somebody I definitely like in this matchup. And then Juan Soto for San Diego against San Francisco, another guy that's really been good against San Francisco this season, averaging almost 9 fantasy points a game against them. Then we look at Kyle Tucker against Philly, who is a tough matchup, but he's one of the few guys on Houston. I think they can definitely get to him. And even though he's been a little bit boom or bust lately, he's still a decent option. Toscar Hernandez is another guy I think is going to hit a home run today. He's averaging a whopping 14 fantasy points a game. He's had 5 home runs in the last 10, and he has some real opportunity for a massive game here against Baltimore. And then Taylor Ward for the Angels. He's in a great spot here. His price is finally starting to come up some, but he's hitting 421, so of course that's going to happen. And 13 games against Oakland, he has 5 home runs, averaging 12 fantasy points a game, which is crazy. And then finally, Dylan Moore for Seattle. I didn't mention him at second base, but I meant to because I wanted to mention him here in outfield. He's averaging 7.4 fantasy points a game. I think he's probably a top option at this position today in the outfield because of his consistently lately. So with that said, I don't think the slate is ideal on DraftKings. I think it's a lot better on FanDuel because the guy's a little bit more balanced when it comes to pricing. It's going to be a little bit harder, but you do have a decent chunk of pitchers that you could utilize that are cheaper on this slate. So it's, obviously some positions like third base, there's really only 3 or 4 guys, second base, there's only 2 or 3 guys there, but all of them are good, but some of them actually have multi-base potential, so you could definitely use multiple guys there. Other bases like third base don't really look very ideal at all today, and then first base looks like it's got a bunch. So overall, though, we have some good value. I think it's going to be a good slate. If you have any comments or questions, feel free to leave them below. If there's any players that you think that I missed or something like that, feel free to leave that below. And obviously the only teams that, like I said again, are still vying for playoff situations are Philadelphia and Milwaukee and Philadelphia and Milwaukee, I'm sorry. A little bit dyslexic. So those 2 teams are teams that I definitely think pitching are going to go deep in the game, especially if they can keep it under control. And then also the Mets because they're trying to get to Atlanta. So with that said, thank you guys again for liking, commenting, subscribing, and have a nice day.